C'est mon plaisir. That's as much French as I can give you. And I think what's actually that inspiring introduction that we heard from the consulate, I'm actually African Francophone. And we have one in attendance, my mom. And I'm from Mauritius, an island in Africa, and then we moved to Canada, so it's for the bilingualism there, the French-English bilingualism that occurs there. So it's really nice to see all these different areas that French is actually worldwide. And so the title of my talk is How Learning Two Languages Positively Impacts Cognitive Development. How many of you here would consider yourself a monolingual? So a person who only knows one language. Okay, great. How many of you here would consider yourself a bilingual? Okay, great, so you're gonna love my talk. I'm just kidding, you'll still love my talk. How many of you have absolutely no idea? Like maybe you're monolingual in some areas, sometimes you're bilingual, you're somewhere in between. Anyone? No? Okay. Okay, well, bilingualism can be viewed along a continuum. So in research, we strive for those individuals that are at the extremes. So we strive for the individuals that have no exposure to another language. Or we look for those that are highly proficient in two languages who use them on a daily basis. But those instances are actually quite rare. What we typically find are people that fall in the middle. And the reason why is that there are so many factors that impact bilingualism. These factors include proficiency, how large your vocabulary is in each language, usage, how often you use those languages, age of acquisition, did you acquire them at an early age, and language dominance, is one language stronger than the other? And there are so many more factors. So as you can see, studying bilingualism is complex. Bilingualism in society. So I wanted to contrast what bilingualism looks like in the United States versus what it looks like in Canada. So in the United States, the primary group are Spanish-English bilinguals that are in research. They typically are recent immigrants. But bilingualism in Canada includes many languages, and many of them are heritage language speakers. So across all the studies I'll be talking about, unless I mention a specific language group, it includes a heterogeneous group of bilinguals, okay? So some of them will know Cantonese English, some of them Korean, there's a variety of different languages, okay? And the Greater Toronto Area, which is where York University is located, there are 5.8 million people. 63% of households use a non-English, non-French language, over 200 languages, as you can see. It's very rich in linguistic diversity. The top 5 are Cantonese, Mandarin, Punjabi, Italian, and Tagalog. So this is a very safe space, so you can be honest. There are some common myths that are associated with bilingualism in childhood. How many of you here believe that bilingualism will delay language acquisition in children? I see your face, you're like, no, absolutely not. And you're right. I mean, in terms of the vocabulary size, the bilingual does, in comparison to the monolingual students, they do know fewer words, that's true in the research, but if you combine all the languages they know, their vocabulary size is actually quite large. But in each language, they know fewer words than their monolingual counterparts. And that's because they're managing their time across multiple languages, okay? But the rate at which they're acquiring a language is exactly the same. How many of you believe that the language spoken in the home will negatively impact the school language? No, that's false. If anything, it'll actually help you learn and acquire another language because you've had exposure to some grammar in that language, so it can actually help you learn another one. How many of you believe that bilingualism will confuse the child and that they will always mix their languages? Anyone? No? And that's completely false. Bilingualism will not confuse the child. They get really good at understanding that, for example, grandma only speaks Spanish. They get really good at knowing, I'm going to use that one language with that person. But in an environment where both languages are always active, then of course they will be open to using both. But they're pretty good at picking up on that pattern of just one person and one language. And mixing languages is actually not a bad thing. There's something called, in the literature, code switching. This is when a person is so proficient that they can effortlessly switch between languages. So it's actually a good thing. So all of these things are completely false. What's going on in the bilingual brain? Bilinguals have two interacting language systems that are virtually active all the time and competing for attention. So as you can see here, that's the first language system, and the other language system is overlapping and interacting with that one. So there's this parallel joint activation, and there needs to be some kind of mechanism to select the target language while disregarding the irrelevant language. So for me, for example, I speak French, English, and I have some Creole because I'm from Mauritius. And if I see the word, for example, if I see a dog, the word dog will be activated, but so will the word chien. And those two things will be competing with each other. So there needs to be a mechanism in order to select the correct language within a single utterance. And that, we argue, is the executive functions. That's what's enhanced in the brain when you have to select the correct language. And the executive functions, because it's an important area in the brain, it's actually not limited to just language processing. It actually transfers onto nonverbal domains as well. So executive functions are a set of mental cognitive processes that are important for goal-oriented behavior. They have the ability to initiate and stop actions. They allow you to monitor and change behavior as needed. And you can plan future behaviors when faced with novel tasks. So you've got executive functions. It's an important area in the brain. You need it for virtually everything. Selective attention is a key component of the executive functions. And this is a mechanism that you focus on the relevant features and you disregard the irrelevant features. So just imagine you're in a grocery store and your goal is to find Frosted Flakes. And you know that Frosted Flakes, it comes in a blue packaging, it has a tiger on it, has the words Frosted Flakes on it. So you need to focus on those features while disregarding other features like other colors, other things that might pop out at you, or other words. And eventually you'll use selective attention and find those Frosted Flakes. Okay? So our lab, we examine bilingualism across the lifespan. So we look at pre-verbal infants, we look at school-aged children, adolescents, young adults, and older adults. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to limit just to the first three age groups. So pre-verbal infants, children, and adolescents. Okay, so here in terms of infancy. So these are infants. We compare. Those are bilingually raised environments. So infants that have parents that speak different languages. And we compare them to those that are raised in a monolingual environment, so just a single language. And what we find is that in the first year of life, bilingually raised infants are able to detect language switches. And this study is actually extremely interesting. With just visual cues, no auditory information, bilingual infants can detect a language switch, just visual information alone. They are strategically looking at the eyes and mouths of a speaker, the talking speaker. As for monolingual infants, we'll limit it to just the eyes. And you can think about the mouth as being something that's important for language acquisition. So the fact that bilinguals are using this is a very important strategy. And it's been shown that they're able to override a habitual response as well. In our lab, we were interested in attention. So this is a study that was conducted with a graduate student of Dr. Scott Adler and in collaboration with my supervisor, Dr. Ellen Bialystok. And it's currently under review. And we were interested in it because we know that attention is a fundamental cognitive ability in terms of executive functioning, and that the linguistic environment for bilinguals is much more complex. we wanted to know, does this affect their developing attention systems? So we did this and we tested 6-month-olds. Now, so you can see here, this is the setup of the lab, of the eye trackers at the top over there, and the computer screen will present the stimulus information, and the baby lies down and just looks at the information. So we recruited 20 monolingual infants and 20 bilingual infants that are 6-month-olds. And in the pre-switch condition, we wanted to know, can they learn an association? So for here, you have a cue, and then there's a time delay, and then it has a target. So the checkerboard, whenever it's presented, the target will always appear on the left side of the screen. But whenever a bullseye is presented, the target will always appear on the right side of the screen. So we wanted to see whether monolinguals and bilingual infants can learn this association. And we see that at 6-month-olds, both monolingual and bilingual infants, so the y-axis is percent correct anticipation. So this is being able to anticipate where the reward's gonna be, where the target is gonna be. Both groups are able to do that. They're significantly above chance. And there's no difference in terms of their latency, so how fast they execute an eye movement towards the correct target. But what if we switch those rules? We don't tell them. All of a sudden, we just switch the rules. So they suddenly see that now a checkerboard response is to the right, and the bullseye predicts a target on the left. What happens then? Well, what we see here is that only the bilingual group in the post-switch condition is able to correctly anticipate the location of the target greater than chance, and that there's a huge difference in terms of their latency in how they execute an eye movement to the correct target. And throughout my talk, sorry, I forgot to mention this, that the monolinguals are always labeled in red and the bilinguals are labeled in blue. Okay. So bilingual infants at 6 months can learn the associations better than monolingual infants. So in terms of the infancy research, we see that the effects of bilingualism can be detected quite early, as early as 6 months. Infants raised in a bilingual household show greater attentional control to stimuli in their environments than those raised in a monolingual household. But what happens to school-age children who now are able to use a language? They're able to produce the language. Because remember, before I was just talking about pre-verbal infants who are exposed to 2 languages or 1 language, but they are not able to produce it yet. So now we're going to move on to school-aged children. This was a study that was conducted by a former graduate student, Raluca Barak, and Dr. Ellen Bialystok. They had 37 monolinguals and 25 bilingual 5-year-olds. And they were matched on a variety of measures, including age, SES, and IQ. And this is a task that we typically use in executive control or executive function literature. It's called the flanker task. And it's made to be very child-friendly, so that's why they're fish, but usually they're arrows. Okay, so the task is to respond to the direction that the fish is moving towards, or that the fish is pointing towards. So you can see in the neutral condition, there's only 1 fish, super easy. They just need to point left or right, using 2 mouse that are on each side of the computer screen. So in this example, the single fish is pointing to the left is the correct answer. We also have congruent and incongruent trials. The congruent trials, you can see that the surrounding fish are all pointing in the same direction as the target middle fish. That makes it a very easy trial, and there's facilitation. But the incongruent trial, so the goal is still to respond to the middle fish, you can see that the surrounding fish are pointing in the opposite direction. So this is going to create a longer response time, and you need to override the information from the surrounding fish. And as I mentioned before, they were equivalent on all these background measures. And what you see here, so accuracy is plotted on the y-axis, and the greater the accuracy, the better. And you can see that for the congruent and incongruent trial, the bilinguals are performing better. They're more accurate than the monolingual children. How about culture? So this is looking at different language pairs. So that we recruited 26 English monolinguals and had 30 Chinese English bilinguals, 28 French English bilinguals, and 20 Spanish English bilinguals. They're all 5 years of age, and they're matched on age, SES, and IQ. We want to know, well, does it matter what type of language it is or what language pairs they are? This is another task that is also explored in the executive functions literature. It's called task switching. So you're presented with two options, either a blue horse or a red cow, and you're given a stimulus here that has both competing information. And you need to sort the trial based on the cue. So here the cue is for shape. So this would go into the blue horse box. If this was a color wheel, then this would be sorted in the red box. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So there are many blocks. The first block is a pure block. So this is the very first block, you're only sorting by one dimension. So for example, you're only sorting by shape. So that's really easy. And the next block, you'll only sort by color. That's also very easy. The mixed block is when you intermix the two cues, you intermix the rules. Okay, so that's quite challenging. And in this block, you can look at non-switch trials and switch trials. And there are two different types of analyses you can do. One is called the local cost. So this is the amount of switching ability required within the mixed block. And there's also something called the global cost, which is the difference that the mixing effect produces. So comparing the non-switch trials from the mixed block, comparing those to the non-switch trials to the pure block. And what the authors found, so the black bar are the monolinguals, and the other gray, the shades of gray are the different bilingual groups. So the one on the left is the Chinese English bilinguals, the one in the middle is the French bilinguals, and the one all the way to the right, which is the white bar, those are the Spanish bilinguals. And you can see that there's no difference in the local cost, but there was a difference in the global cost. So the y-axis is time, and the monolinguals are taking longer to do for the global cost. So bilinguals are better at maintaining a task set across the mixed block, an advantage that's found across all three bilingual groups. Now one thing it got cut off at the top, but it's basically looking at the relationship between socioeconomic status and bilingualism. So we know from previous research that another factor that impacts the executive functions is socioeconomic status. So those that are in impoverished or low SES groups, they're not receiving enough enriched environment from linguistic or social or cognitive. They're not getting enough resources or stimulation. So we wanted to know whether or not bilingualism will boost that or would mitigate those effects. So this was an interesting study conducted by Hartanto. And as I mentioned before, it's a very large-scale study. So this included 18,200 children that were tracked from 5 to 7 years of age. The full range of SES is included. So not only is it looking at the dual income, but it's also looking at occupation of the parents as well as level of education. So they wanted to know, does bilingualism affect executive functioning independently of the disparities in socioeconomic status within the bilinguals? This is great. Sorry, these taking pictures. I can wait. Another group of researchers wanted to look at brain development and socioeconomic status and bilingualism. So this is Natalie Brito and her group. And they wanted to look at brain size, the cortical volume that's modified by socioeconomic status. They had a large group of children and adolescents, so 562 children and adolescents between the ages of 3 and 20 across a range of SES. So once again, SES was measured the same way as in the previous study. There are 281 bilinguals and 281 monolinguals. And you'll notice that those numbers are exactly the same, and there was a reason for it. Because of the fact that you're looking at the brain, you want to have a matched sample. You want to make sure that they're equal in gender, age, SES, well not SES, gender, age, and a bunch of IQ, a bunch of different variables to make sure that the only change that you're seeing is the brain. Okay? So what the authors found, so on the left, the y-axis, you'll see that it's a total cortical surface area, and the bottom is plotted by lower SES versus higher SES. And you'll see that the cortical volume for the low SES children in the bilingual group is significantly greater than the monolingual group, okay? So this is kind of the similar findings as the Hartanto, that there's something happening to the brain that bilingualism is providing a boost. And it's the area in the brain that actually, when they perform these region of interest analysis, is in the anterior cingulate cortex, this area right here. And that area is actually really important for many things. But one of the things that it's important for is something called conflict monitoring. And what did I mention before? I mentioned earlier that bilingual languages are competing, always in conflict with each other. So it's no surprise that that's the area that's giving a boost. And that area is actually quite important for the executive functions. Okay? So in summary, we see with the bilingual children can outperform monolingual children on a variety of different executive function tasks. As I mentioned earlier, bilingualism can narrow socioeconomic disparities in early childhood in executive functioning. And so somehow it's mitigating the negative effect of low SES by providing an enriched linguistic environment. But how long do these effects last? Can we detect these differences in adolescence? So this is something that I'm particularly interested in. I've done research on young adults as well, but I wanted to tackle this age group because honestly, there's not any research studies out there that looks at adolescence in terms of bilingualism and cognition. There's maybe only 5, which is absurd to me. So I wanted to tackle this question because what's really interesting with adolescence is that the developmental trajectory of the executive functions peaks. So as you can see, it goes from age 1 all the way to adulthood, and 15 is right there. And you can see that there's a gradual increase, but around 15 years of age, 14, 15, it tailors off. So I was wondering, well, do the monolinguals catch up, or are we still going to detect differences? Who knows? Because of the fact that this thing is, it tailors off and it peaks. So last year, or not even last year, it was back in February, I mentioned that the study hasn't been published yet, but it has now, so that's great. So we recruited 33 monolingual high school students and 32 bilingual high school students from 2 different private schools, and they were around 15 to 16 years of age. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the flanker task. Remember the fish? This is the adult version with the arrows. And you can see that on the y-axis, it's mean reaction time. So it's the amount of time that it takes to respond to this trial type. You can see that the monolinguals on both the congruent and incongruent trial types, they're slower to respond than the bilinguals. Okay? So across childhood and adolescence, bilingualism positively impacts performance on nonverbal executive function tasks. But how about in dual language programs, which is what I'm sure you guys are all interested in? Are the effects the same if the child acquires the second language through formal education versus in the home? What's really interesting is that the dual language programs in the United States, well, one thing to note is that there's so many different types, which is great because in Canada we only have French immersion study. We don't really have, there's no Chinese English or Spanish English, it's just French. And on top of that, it's grown tremendously. It used to be only a handful of programs available back in the 70s, and now as we speak, there's more than 500 across the United States, which is amazing. So this particular set of studies, because it's published in three different journal articles, but it looked at dual language programs specifically in 6 public schools in southeastern United States. These schools had low income with racial, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. 87% of the children qualified for federally funded lunch assistance. 10% of the adult population had a college degree. And the Spanish-English, so this one is a Spanish-English dual language two-way immersion program that ran from kindergarten all the way to grade 5. And the instruction was 50% Spanish and 50% English. And they had measures of not just executive functions, but they also had measures of academic performance and statewide performance on standardized tests. So this is another test that's used in executive function literature. It's called the trail making test. So you would begin where it says begin at number 1, and there are different types of trails that you can do. So the first trail is based on numbers. So you go to 1, and then you'd have to find the 2, and then find the 3, because all the numbers are scattered all over the place. So it's a quite challenging task. The other trail is to do it based on letters. So now you're going from A to B to C, D, and that's also quite challenging. But the most challenging one is trail C, where you're alternating between number, letter, number, letter. So there's almost like a working memory component to it. You have to keep track what letter, what number you were looking at. So for this study, what they ended up looking at is just the trail C, the most difficult one. And the comparison group, which is in the light gray, those are the ones that went to the traditional only English programs. And the ones in the dark gray are the dual language Spanish-English programs. And they looked at kindergarten and found no differences, and that's not surprising. These kids have only had 6 months of dual language program exposure. So of course, you're not gonna find any differences. But when you look at grades 2 and 4, you see that the dual language group, they're actually performing this task much faster than the traditional all English group. But many parents had questions about the standardized test because of the fact that they're only in English, right? And these students that they're learning Spanish, is the Spanish instruction going to impact their English performance? Because these standardized tests are also a way for them to move on to pass to the next grade level. So they were quite concerned about that. When you look at grades 4 and 5, there's absolutely no differences on statewide standardized tests. And in fact, the dual language program students had better grades in terms of just overall in their class, they had better grades. Oh, I had a slide there before that said like, should you do a dual language program? Yes, of course. Sorry, so that's like my little tidbit. Yes, of course, you should. Sorry. So why should you continue using 2 languages? There are many benefits, including social, cognitive, and neurodegenerative. Some of the social benefits are that you have greater acceptance of other cultures. You're able to more accepting of differences. Because some individuals are bicultural. You know, they have Korean, for example, and they have a North American English side as well. So some of them are bicultural. Research has shown that they have better self-control and emotional regulation. They're better on tasks that tap into creativity, multitasking, and problem solving. And there are more job opportunities inside and outside of the US. So studies have shown that bilinguals earn more money on average in the United States. And one thing, as I was flying into here, the Border Patrol officer had asked me, well, why are you here? Like, why are you coming to San Fran? And I was like, well, I'm giving a talk on the cognitive benefits of being bilingual. And he was like, oh, that's amazing, and started speaking to me in Spanish. And I was like, I have no clue what you're saying, but that's great that you're using both languages. I'm so happy for you. And he's like, well, one of the benefits is that I get paid 5% more than those that only know one language. So this is direct evidence of that one quote that I have. Yeah. Which is the timing is impeccable. Yeah. And honestly, the biggest thing is the fact that you will be able to speak another language. Isn't that amazing? You're able to use another language. But one of the most striking findings in the literature, it has to do with the Alzheimer's and dementia literature. So why should you continue using 2 languages? Well, this is where I'm going to sell you one. So what happens when cognitive aging is not typical? It's accompanied by impairment. And the primary symptom of dementia is memory failure. Can bilingualism protect against dementia? So this is a number, so each thing you see here is a separate study. Sorry, the formatting at the bottom is squished. But each bar here, like each of these is a different study. And the striking pattern that you see is that the mean age of diagnosis of dementia is 4.1 or 4 to 5 years later than monolinguals. So there's something to do with having to cope with different demands from your linguistic environment that transfers all the way to older adulthood, that you're able to cope with the memory failures of dementia. 4 to 5 years, that's really big, because you're able to improve on the quality of life for much longer. So the effect of bilingualism across the lifespan. Infants raised with 2 languages in the environment develop different attention networks. Bilingual children and adolescents are more adept at nonverbal tasks based on conflict. Bilinguals are more resilient against cognitive decline and the symptoms of dementia. And one last thing, it's really never too late to learn a second language. This study here has shown that there is an advantage on tests of auditory attention that extends into late bilingualism. Okay? So it's never too late to learn another language. But thank you so much for having me. That's my supervisor, Dr. Ellen.